Today I'm doing a brake job on my wife's Pilot. It's a 2009 Honda Pilot and it needed new rotors and pads. I ordered the rotors and pads from Parts Avatar, and last week when I went to change them, I discovered that my calipers were also bad. These slide pins on my old calipers were completely seized. Now I guess it's possible that I could have attempted to free up these slide pins, lubricate them and reuse them, but I didn't like that idea, especially considering the pretty economical purchase price of a whole new caliper assembly. And so that's the road I chose to go. I've completed the right side. Let's go over to the left side and I'll walk you through what I did. The first thing you're going to need is a good jack to be able to lift your wheel off the ground. And once you've got it off the ground, I want you to put a jack stand underneath there. Another thing I should mention is either chock your rear wheels or set your e-brake if you know it's working properly. In fact, best practice is to set your e-brake and chock your wheels. I don't have a lot of tools, but because I'm old and my wrists are sore and my back is sore, what I do have are a few tools that I like to use when I'm doing a job like this. I then like to turn my steering wheel to the right or to the left to give me easier access, depending on which side I'm working on. And another thing that you must do is you need to remove the brake line. The brake line is full of brake fluid. In order to do this, what I like to do
is using a brake line pinch tool, pinch off the brake line so that you don't lose any fluid out of your reservoir. Now, in my case, I don't have a pinch tool, so I use a small vice grip that I've covered the surfaces of with some rubber fuel line.
Just like that. And in doing so, I can now undo this banjo bolt and remove this brake line, and any fluid that spills out of here is coming from the caliper itself. And for this vehicle, which is a 2009 Honda Pilot, this is a 14mm bolt. Your mileage may vary, depending on what vehicle you have. Next to come off is the actual caliper, and it's just these two bolts. And what I'm looking at for those ones is a 17mm socket. And like I said, I had this apart last week. It should be easy to come apart, especially because when I reassembled the bolts, I used anti-seize on them, which is always a good idea for parts like this that can be a little bit more susceptible to corrosion. Now with those bolts loose, this should just come right off like that. I mentioned that when I reassembled this last time, I used anti-seize on the bolts so that they would come apart easier. And I don't anticipate any problems with these ones down here, but on the other side, it hadn't been apart in years, and it would not come easily. I had to use some penetrating fluid on these, plus I also had to use heat. I had to use a torch and apply heat right on this knuckle here and on this knuckle here, and then using my impact wrench to get these bolts out. I just have a small torch that I use for this kind of a thing, and it works well. 19mm for these guys. Now, if I was just replacing the caliper assembly, I'd be ready to start putting this back together, but I'm not. I'm also changing these rotors, so bear with me as I do that.
Now, if this was a new rotor, I would not be doing this one, but this one is being discarded.
Sometimes they kind of get frozen on here, and you got to bang on them a bit to get them to release. They kind of get rusty on the back, and it makes it difficult to release there sometimes, and so you need to apply a little persuasion. Now, as I mentioned, I'd already ordered a new set of rotors, and so these are them there. Look how pretty it is. But before I install that, and I am using a clean rag, I'm hitting it with some brake clean to wipe off any residual oils or contaminants that may be on the surface. These little screws do not need to be terribly tight. They're just holding the rotor in place while you reassemble. And now that I've got the rotor back on there, I'm going to grab the steering wheel, turn this whole assembly out to the left again to give me better access to the bolts in the back. And with my wheel out, I have access, and reassembly is just the opposite order of disassembly. And I'm not going to overdo it at this point either. I'm just Just tightening up enough to make sure there's nothing, everything's tight, it's not sloppy, because when all is said and done, I'm going to put a torque wrench on these and tighten them up to their specific torque setting, which is also very important. And just for reference, the front caliper bracket bolts are 100 foot-pounds, and the front caliper guide pin bolts are 52 foot-pounds. This caliper assembly came with a new banjo bolt and 2 new copper washers. How about that? Once I've put the entire assembly on, I've loosened off these bolts, this one just a little bit, this one I'm removing, the top one here for the actual caliper itself, so I can open it up and put my brake pads in. A couple of things to take note of when putting the brake pads in. One is this little tab here. That's a wear indicator. Have you ever heard a set of brakes that squeal really, really loudly? What happens there is that's when the brake pad itself has worn down completely, and this tab is actually rubbing against the side of the rotor. And when that happens, it makes a very loud, shrill noise. So don't rip it off. It's supposed to be there. And if you're trying to put it on, put your brake pad on the outside and you're fighting with it because this piece of the caliper assembly is in the way, you know it goes on the inside, where it's got the clearance to fit here. Another thing I like to do before putting the brake pad in is just a dab of grease in these little slots down here, or on the tips of the pads themselves. And when I say a dab, I mean just a very small amount. And when I say small amount, this is what I'm talking about. Not much at all. It just goes on the very end. You don't want it to get down onto the pad itself, because then that's going to negate the whole function of the pad. You just want a little bit on the end to help with sliding and no corrosion happening in these channels here. It's also very important to use the right type of grease. The tabs on the ends of the pad just slip up into these little grooves that are intended for them. With both brake pads in place, I am almost ready to slide this caliper back up and over. There are 2 little spring clips that go into these tiny holes in the backs of the pads. And what they do is help force the pads out. It helps minimize the amount of rubbing when you're not applying pressure on the brakes. I wanted to give you a shot of both the spring clips in place, so you see them there.
You almost need 3 hands to insert the spring clips, hold the pads in place while rotating the caliper back into its original position so that it captures the pads and you can remove your hand.
Like that. Okay, at this point, I am now ready to tighten and torque my bolts. Well, there it is. Everything's back together. The only thing left to do now is bleed the brakes, and that's easier done with 2 people. I'm going to see if my wife's available. I need someone to gently pump the pedal as I open and close the bleeder valve on the brake caliper itself. She will not want to be filmed during this process. When I'm bleeding brakes like this, I like to get a small little hose. This is just an old piece of gas line. Surgical tubing works as well. And I like to slip it over top of the bleeder valve. That way I can control the dribble and it's not puking all over the side of my brand new, clean, shiny caliper. I can direct it to a reservoir, capture the brake fluid when it starts to come out. Once you've got your brakes bled, your wheels back on, your lug nuts on and torqued to spec, then you're ready to take it for a test drive and scrub your brakes in. And when I say scrub your brakes in, I mean it'll take a few kilometers for the brake pads themselves to kind of mate with the rotors and wear in and scuff off any kind of glossy layer on them. Hopefully this video was helpful, and once again, thanks to Parts Avatar for supplying the parts. I'm going to sign off now and say thanks for watching. See you next time.